Okay, so this is a third video on 6.7, and we have 2 points here, like in others, but there's something different about these 2 points. Okay, but let's start the same way. We're first going to start with the amplitude, so the highest value minus the lowest over 2. Amplitude here is going to be 3, which means that my vertical shift will be down 1. So let's just draw my midline here. So vertical shift is down 1. Okay. All right, so let's, what I wanted to make note of is the fact that, all right, normally sine starts on the midline and goes up. So we're going to say this is where my sine graph would normally start. So it looks like it's been shifted over to the right some. So assume that this would, if we were an unshifted sine graph, it would hit the midline at 0 and then go up to its highest point at pi over 2. So these angles would correspond to quadrant 1 angles. Then it would go back down to 0. So this would be quadrant 2 angles. Then here would be quadrant 3, and then here quadrant 4. So this is going to be important when we plug in these points to figure out what is the angle when I take the sine that I get a particular value. So it's smart to do that, to first figure out, okay, where does sine normally start? And let's figure out where the closest is to the y-axis for that starting point. And then let me label, if I were going around the circle, the different quadrants. Because remember, this graph is just a elongated or putting on a two-dimensional xy axis. What's happening when you plot the angles and the ratios, thinking of going around that circle. So going through quadrant 1, 2, 3, 4, and then angles keeping on going up. So but you're going around the circle again. Okay, so let's put what we have here. We've got y equals 3 sine. We need to find b and c. And down 1. Okay, so let's plug in the first point, which is 14 pi over 3, comma, negative 2.5. So I'm going to write it as a fraction. Negative 5/2 equals 3 sine 14 pi over 3b minus c minus 1. So if I add 1, that will be, that will make that negative 3/2 divided by 3 is negative 1/2. So negative 1/2 equals sine 14 pi over 3b minus c. Okay, so now looking here, sine of what angle gives me negative 1/2? Well, now let's go to our point here. This was the point we plugged in. Well, that should correspond, according to my graph, a quadrant 3 angle. So what's the quadrant 3 angle? When I take the sine, I get negative 1/2, and this would be the first time I'm hitting quadrant 3. Well, that would be, going back to my black pen here, 14 pi over 3b minus c equals 7 pi over 6. Okay. Now let's plug in my second point here. So again, the y-coordinate is the same, and I've got equals 3 sine 7 pi b minus c minus 1. So I'm also getting negative 1/2, which isn't a surprise given the y-coordinate's the same, equals sine of 7 pi b minus c. Well, now I want a quadrant 4 angle. When I take the sine, I get negative 1/2, and that will be 11 pi over 6. Okay, so now let us subtract this other. So let's do minus 14 pi over 3b plus c equals negative 7 pi over 6. I'm just solving the systems of equations now. So 7 pi b in terms of third is 21 pi b over 3, and subtracting 14 pi b over 3, I get 7 pi b over 3. The c's cancel, and 11 pi over 6 minus 7 pi over 6 will be, oops, my b doesn't look right, will be 2 pi over 3. So solving for b here, I'm going to get 2/7. All right, now let's plug in 2/7 into one of the equations to find c. So 2/7 minus c equals 7 pi over 6. Let me move down a little bit. So I get then 4 pi over 3 minus 7 pi over 6 equals c. So c ends up being pi over 6 when I make a common denominator. Okay, so now putting these all together into an equation, I get y equals 3 sine, my b was 2/7 minus, oops, I'm realizing I wrote pi over 8 instead of pi over 6, minus pi over 6 minus 1. Okay, so there's the sign, and now remember that was the hard part. Now, rewriting in terms of cosine, 3. I'm going to say 90 minus my angle that I took the sine of, minus 1, so y equals 3 cosine negative 2/7x plus, this is going to be 2 pi over 3 minus 1, taking out a negative. Again, we want that coefficient of x to be positive. So 2/7x minus 2 pi over 3. And cosine of negative an angle is the same as cosine of the positive counterpart. So we're just going to have y equals 3 cosine 2/7x minus 2 pi over 3 minus 1. That's a 7. All right, and there you have that. So the reason that was hard is you have to orient yourself to what quadrant are my points in, and picking your starting point, whether it's sine or cosine, and then labeling where those points fall.